Hello. Before we begin this episode, we discussed the films Fantasia and Allegro non Troppo. If you haven't seen either of these, I recommend doing so. If you don't have the 3.5 hours needed for that, I recommend at the very least seeing the Vals Triste segment from Allegro non Troppo. I'll be linking that one in the comments. So, check it out. The other note is that this was a very chaotic recording session, and we wound up losing the last 15 minutes of the discussion. So at the end, I'll be going over the main points from that, and that will give us a nice little bow to close off the episode. Alrighty, we are here once again with a Pichy and Palscast. I remembered the display picture this time, but I forgot my USB hub, so we are running on 2 microphones tonight. I am here once again with...
Melty Man.
And Solid.
Well, you're not going with a gimmick name each week, it appears, Melty Man. So, how are you guys feeling right now?
I'm a lot of things, I guess. I'm tired. It's been a long day.
Understandable. How about you, Solid? How are you feeling?
Well, you guys, we have said what we just watched, or we just.
I haven't said that yet. I'm just starting off with a hi. How are you?
Hi, how are you? Feelings of fraudulence, which will make sense once we start actually talking about.
How does
but that is what I'm feeling right now.
How do you feel in comparison to about 90 minutes ago?
No, it's about the same.
All right. So
that was my first note that I took when I first started watching the movies that we watched today.
Fraudulence. Right, that's the theme for tonight, everyone. So what we did is we watched Fantasia and we watched Allegro non Troppo, an Italian film from 1976. This was Solid's first time seeing Fantasia, I believe.
Yes.
And Melty Man's first time in roughly 25 years.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
The idea of taking 25 years between watching something is quite scary to me. Like,
I mean, not actually 25 years. It's more like 22, but yeah.
Yes.
it's close enough.
Well, it was 26 years between these two films being made, and... Wait, no, that's 36 years, my bad. Still, quite a little ride that we have just had over the last 3.5 hours.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Fantasia is a film that I do somewhat like, but it's also very much in the Blade Runner camp for me, of a film that I have more respect than actual like for, because it was a groundbreaking piece of material. On a technical level, there is some incredible stuff in there, but a lot of it is quite the slog.
Yeah, it certainly, after seeing Allegro non Troppo afterwards, was very much like when we first rewatching Fantasia, I was kind of like, hey, this is kind of cool. They're trying something new. I mean, the idea that Disney wanted to make one of these every year is kind of a bit frightening.
Yeah, so the bit of the context there is, after Walt Disney came up with the whole Fantasia film concept, it was originally born from the Mickey short, and he then decided to expand into a feature film. Then, being the hardcore capitalist he is, decided that what he would do is every year cycle in and out different sequences of new footage with some older ones to create like a touring band sort of dynamic, and that would be his way to milk this film for years and years and years to come. Since it was 1940 when the film came out, exportation wasn't an option due to the war, and so the plan kind of fell through, and it was later screenings in the 50s and 60s where he really made the money back.
It's truly terrifying, the idea that we could be where we're watching a lot of these types of films. Soon we watched 2 today, but
yes,
we're gonna continue. The idea of watching however many that would be, one every year for this podcast is truly terrifying.
Well, the next ones we'll be watching are somewhat different, so my idea for these couple of shows was to do what I tend to think of as the Fantasia suite, where we start off with Fantasia, then move into a direct parody with Allegro non Troppo, which is going to allow for much more interesting discussion, because after we watched Fantasia, Solid was saying, well, we should just talk about that now, but I really wanted the recontextualization that Allegro non Troppo gives to the text. Then next time we'll be going over Heavy Metal, Robot Carnival, and then Fantasia 2000 to cap things off. Those two are way more dialogue heavy and are way more just short story anthologies, but there's a lot of influence in the visuals of Fantasia, as well as the formatting and also music, particularly in heavy metal. There's a very It's really fun to contrast some of the music and editing used in these in comparison to when we get to heavy metal next time.
Yeah, the music was very much a very enjoyable aspect of this, at least.
Oh yeah, it's all great music.
Yeah, I don't think besides I guess more of the more kind of generic feeling pieces, I don't think I particularly disliked any of the music. It was more of, I guess, the sequences and the stories that were kind of set to them where it was like the interesting stuff kind of came in, I guess.
Yeah. So for reference, we watched the Blu-ray cut, which is from 2010, which from memory is the same cut as the 2000 release of Fantasia. Main difference there is Deems Taylor, the host who was a music critic at the time. During the restoration process, all his audio tracks got damaged beyond repair, and so he's actually being dubbed over by a voice actor called Corey Burton in the cut we watched.
I thought it looked like he was being overdubbed.
Yes,
And
that's because he was.
There you go. Oh.
So, you look like you want to say something there, Solid.
Oh, well, it was just like I mentioned feelings of fraudulence. People are like wondering why I said something like that.
Let's elaborate on that now.
I feel like what Adam said about Blade Runner is perfect for Fantasia, and I feel like there's my main thoughts are like I'm sure there's so many interesting things to talk about, to learn and discuss from this film about choreography and how to tell stories through visual means and all that, but my overwhelming reaction to this is just utter boredom, really. And
Yep.
and like we're doing a podcast about like talking about movies, and even before this podcast, I'd like to think of myself as someone who, well, maybe not a critic, is just someone who might like to think about the films and shows and
You like to engage with the text.
Yeah, so I would think that something like this I should be more excited for, that I should be saying, oh yes, I love all the imagery and I love the metaphors at play here, or the themes, but no, I was just bored throughout the entire thing.
Something that in the time that I've known you, is you really like to engage with not just text in a textual sense, but you're very into narrative. And these, particularly Fantasia, is very light on narrative. Yeah. At its most, you get Night on Bald Mountain, and I can talk about that. Certainly, I'll be getting to it. But most of what we'll be discussing really is more just theming and semiotics as we go across this, is really what these first two films are really about. So I think we'll go through these actually in chronological order and sequence, and I think that's the best way to get the discussion rolling. So we begin with Deems Taylor welcoming us to Fantasia, an all-new form of entertainment and media. It's easy, I see Solid here having a very smug smirk on his face and a slight look of resignation, but, in 1940, this was still a time where people were still working at how talkies worked, let alone something which is essentially a 2-hour-long music video. And so, some explanatory dialogue is acceptable in that time. There was something else I was going to make you watch tonight, and after rewatching it last night with Melty Man here, I decided against it because it would make you want to die.
Oh, that. Yeah, okay.
So, then the first sequence is Toccata and Fugue in D minor by Johann Sebastian Bach, and this is one of the very rare instances of this in visual media, where there's no vampire connotations.
Oh, yeah. I haven't actually seen Nosferatu.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the original Nosferatu which started it all. Please forgive me if I've got that wrong, chat. My early vampire movies memories are pretty sloppy.
Yeah, that was F.W. Murnau in the 20s.
And yeah, just the classic organ. Do-do-do, do-do-do-do. And it's a great visual statement of, hey, look, we got color. It's certainly the film is trying to ease you into the concept of syncing up visuals to music. And so it does so by, first of all, not even opting for the animation to begin with. It's just, here are shots of the orchestra with some really cool lighting. Very simple backdrop with backlighting, lots of shadows from additional spotlights around. And it's very fun throughout the times that you get orchestral shots in the film. Just the way that they've rigged up lights to flash when, say, timpanis is getting struck, that sort of thing is very cool, but also utterly meaningless.
It's a very mainstream kind of way, like what might have been mainstream back then, of just trying to help people who might not be very knowledgeable about just moving pictures in general, maybe.
It's a pretty mainstream thing even now. Let's see, it was about, I think it was about 15 years ago now, actually, but there was a time after the turn of the century that I went to a performance by the Adelaide Symphony Orchestra at the Festival Theatre, which was built around, hey look, we're putting some visuals in time to the music, and that was just some lighting around the stage and a projector which played some pictures to try and shape your perception of the music. So even now, it's still a fairly mainstream and bog standard basic way of doing things. Certainly a bit later I'll be making some Winamp comparisons, but certainly if you're around the turn of the century using media players, going, whoa, look at the way the computer has generated some strange visuals that sync up to the music. And this was very much the handcrafted equivalent of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so the other thing I have here, I mean, first of all, there's some early demonstrations of rotoscoping with the bowstrings, which leads to a nice transition where it then moves into completely freeform animation. A lot of very fun. Certainly this is classic gold, very, very start of Disney, so squash and stretch everywhere. There's some fun examples if you're looking for good technical loadouts here. But really, I think the real value of this opening segment is that you can riff for days on this segment because you can read whatever you want into it. There was one brief moment in the colors and the flashes that looked kind of like the Instagram hot dog. So, like, no matter what social context in, there's so little there that you can read whatever you want into it. You know, it's like a Zack Snyder film.
Yeah.
The fact is, it was so vague that I don't even remember what you're talking about, like, at all. Like, I don't actually remember this first piece.
I believe you were checking dinner at the time.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't want to shit on this first piece too hard because I don't. Until you reminded me of the bowstrings and things, I don't remember. Like,
I remember the hot dog.
Yes.
And that's the only bit of this original sequence. I do remember the shots of the orchestra. I remember thinking they looked pretty good. And if it was just a concert, it would have been a pretty good looking concert.
Oh, this would be a wonderful thing to have played during a concert.
Yeah.
Like if you had the orchestra set up and then had a projector of Fantasia, like say the animations in time with them behind them, that would be like a great concert going experience.
Yep.
Like they do in, like say with video game orchestras now, where they sometimes put images of the video game while they...
Yes, I do believe that happened at today's The Video Game Awards.
It wouldn't be the only place that did it.
We're dating this recording, everyone. Oh, I'll be dating it further as we go along in this. I've got some notes about recent political moments. So this is then followed by, of course, good old Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite, using the dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, the Chinese dance, the dance of the flutes, the Arabian dance, the Russian dance, and the waltz of the flowers. Obviously, the Sugar Plum Fairy is probably the most well-known of the music here, but this is all... Hell, this is so mainstream and bog-standard ballet music that the introductory dialogue talks about how this is overplayed, well-known mainstream ballet music.
In 1940.
Yeah, Deems Taylor explicitly saying, you probably haven't seen the ballet, but you've probably heard these songs a million times anyway. As a child, this contained my favourite segment when I was about 5 years old. Even though that was when, you know, as a child I was big on dinosaurs, I still liked the Chinese dance section the most, which is kind of interesting that they managed to make mushrooms somehow come off as a racist caricature. You know, that Disney quality, but...
Oh, God. Why did that only just hit me?
Yeah. Oh, we'll be talking about racial caricatures again in a while. Yeah, I just liked seeing the little mushroom that dances around behind them in the follow-up pizzicato segments. It was cute, and I do like that the animators went to the effort of drawing each mushroom with its own unique silhouette. They aren't all copy-paste following the same sort of movements with the inconsistencies coming from Squash and Stretch. They actually all have slightly different forms. It's a cool touch.
I feel like nostalgia, if there's anything that could probably save this film, I think
Nostalgia.
happy feelings as a child watching random pictures and just enjoying something as simple as a mushroom moving around or seeing dinosaurs or something like that. I feel like if there's anything that could save this film, it's that.
And in some ways, that kind of makes this the ultimate and definitive Disney experience. Because Disney as a company, particularly Walt Disney's Disney, was all about creating this image and this persona that you are buying into this happy, magical world where when you wish upon a star, dreams come true. And you don't need to really think about things, you just need to enjoy being.
And your point about how well drawn those mushrooms were, just make a general point. As much as I was so bored throughout this whole thing, they're nothing but respect for the individual artists and animators. I don't know how many there were, but
a lot.
A lot, I'm guessing.
And they might have even been paid for this one.
Well, they deserve to be paid because just because I personally didn't enjoy it does not mean that I can't see the supreme amount of effort and skill.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on animation or drawing, but I'd imagine that in the 1940s it would have been even harder to make something of this quality as well as they did.
This traditional hand-drawn animation is a jerk no matter what, because you have to draw every single frame by hand.
Yeah, the part that particularly blew me away was definitely the reflections in the water.
Yeah, all the water throughout Fantasia is just gorgeous.
Yeah, it just... I can't even imagine... if they're drawing all of this, I can't even imagine how they managed to pull off water that looks that good without some sort of, weird, movie magic of some sort.
Yeah, there is a bunch of movie magic throughout this, and if you ever look up making of featurettes for this, there have been a number of them. There's one from 1991, I think, where Roy Disney discusses some of the unfortunate implications of this film. We'll be getting to them in a while. Although that does let me segue into the I believe it's the Arabian dance segment where it has the fish, and how even when you're drawing fish, which are just swimming around the water, that even in 1940, perhaps in some ways especially in 1940, they still have to be sexy women fish, where they have these big sultry eyes with these eyelashes in a production where every other animal doesn't, until the wacky ballet at the end. The women still have this come hither look and these big plush lips with the lipstick on, and so what's it? Shape of Water that's coming out. So basically, wanting to have sex with fish people is a universal constant of humanity. This is a millennia-long thing involving Legends of Mermaids. So I guess Disney's just tapping into that cultural subconsciousness here.
Or maybe they created it.
Disney invented sexy fish people. There you go. You heard it here first.
Yeah, Yep.
I did get kind of afraid, watching it. There was, instead of... You know how when you see, the first example, or an example that makes a trope or a particular kind of thing really, really popular, I was wishing actually just... It's oh God, is this where it all came from? This movie that I'm not enjoying at all? Like all these visuals and themes that you see in this film. It was almost annoying me how familiar certain scenes and pieces of music were.
Yeah, I did say that a lot of the visuals in this their influence has been felt for the decades
Influence
since.
is a good word.
And we're going to be seeing a bunch of fun intertextuality coming on when we get around to doing the rest of the films that are classed as part of this suite. Probably my favorite little touch, because a lot of the Tchaikovsky segments here are about taking inanimate objects and making them dance. My favorite is there's a bunch of seeds. I keep wanting to say sycamore seeds, but I know they're not. Anyway, they're these very puffy seeds, not quite like a Father Christmas Scotch thistle. But the way that they managed to make a couple of loose strands of them all look like waving arms, and so it's people in very long billowing ballroom dresses. That's just a really, really cool subtle branch. Because a lot of them are just, hey look, it's a plant, but it's dancing. Whereas this one is just, the seeds blowing on the wind, but it looks like they're dancing. And that's just really cool construction. Like a lot of Fantasia is. Shall we get to the first actual narrative one?
Please.
Alright, The Sorcerer's Apprentice by Paul Dukas, based on a poem by an author who I've forgotten. It's the Mickey short. If you're a kid, you probably saw this because you saw Mickey on the cover, and you wanted to see the Mickey thing. I certainly know that that's the reason my dad saw this at the cinema in '63.
Who knew adding like an amount of narrative to these things would actually make them quite interesting?
Well, it makes them so much more engaging, especially because then you can really appreciate the scene construction and the blocking in this short, where there's just the projections of shadows as Mickey is making bad decisions,
Yeah.
and the way that they're clearly being depicted as far more ominous than he thinks they are at the time. Just great mise-en-scène like that throughout this whole scene.
This was my favorite of this movie,
Yep.
and until a certain one in Del.
Allegro non troppo.
Yeah, there was one that probably beat it in there, but in Fantasia, this was definitely my favorite, and it had the most narrative, had the most focus, the most character.
Yep.
And it's amazing how much that helps. And I really got one of my thoughts here was just how important context is in gaining enjoyment from entertainment. And what you were saying there of like being able to just appreciate the amount of effort and work and craft in this animation throughout the whole film. But it's so much easier to enjoy that with
When you've got just a little bit of actual grounding and pathos.
yeah.
Or even ethos, just some ideas to grasp and discuss.
Yeah.
And that leads me to my notes. So I have two readings of the text here. The first is what I think is the Walt Disney perspective. Because, of course, Walt Disney was a very fiercely ideological capitalist. He was all about, if you've got things, you should exploit them. It is your moral imperative to make as much money as you can. And so I'm seeing that from Walt Disney's perspective, that the Sorcerer's Apprentice is basically the bourgeois telling a cautionary tale about proletariat uprising. That you see, you give the workers that little too much leeway, and they just walk all over you. They don't know what they're doing. They've got no goals. They just have everything becomes chaos. The other reading is, of course, almost the exact opposite, which certainly in 2017 you can read as a cautionary tale about things like Silicon Valley tech culture, where it's just the pursuit of automation above all else will ultimately lead to ruin because you've got no actual conscious or control in order to make sure that the consumption doesn't become relentless consumption.
That was certainly the one that came to my mind first, the latter.
Yeah.
That's the one I prefer, but it's fun to get into Walt's head because he was such a larger-than-life character on screen whenever he presented himself in his constant marketing of his own product.
Yeah, I absolutely. The one that obviously for 21st century people dealing with the potential backlash. Well, not backlash, but like.
But this was post-depression, man.
Oh no, I meant like for us in the context of like where we are, like very much the automation one jumped out at me.
Yeah, even more than just general stories of hubris and tampering with forces you don't understand and trying to grab power that you don't know.
No, it's
how to use. It's just automation.
Yeah, it's just like even just from the perspective of like Mickey could just be like any old young tech guy, or gal, and just makes a thing that kind of runs out of control.
Just, hey guys, I created Uber.
Yeah, absolutely. Disruption.
Yeah,
you basically, Mickey was disrupting the water-carrying market of 1940.
But the actual text, like we're talking about themes and the way of looking at it, it is important, I'd say, just having that basic story of hubris on Mickey's part is what is important here for the most part. It's nice afterwards to think about it.
Well, certainly we can, we're going full on death of the author here and just taking whatever the audience reading at the time of viewing as being important, but there is a core emotional core to this story, and that's why it works and becomes somewhat timeless.
It cannot be more overstated just how different this was compared to almost every other short.
Absolutely every other short that's in Fantasia.
It is so much better, I think, than all the rest merely because of that. It's funny that I ended up liking the Mickey one out of all the rest. It feels like a bit of a...
This is this was after the point where essentially the public had considered Mickey Mouse as jumping the shark. And this was intended as part of his revival in pop cultural consciousness.
But I am not a fanboy. So because it could have been anyone. It could have been anyone. That's what's.
It could have been, like, say, Sora from Kingdom Hearts. Because, you know, Yen Sid is quite the accomplished wizard in the Kingdom Hearts series. Those games. And when I say sentences like that, you just realize just how amazing Kingdom Hearts is, that this project even exists. So, Rite of Spring by Igor Stravinsky. I believe this was your favorite segment, Melty Man.
Mostly just because I really like the piece of music.
Yep.
I like Stravinsky and I like I thought the visuals were really nice. It just from like away from, I guess, like I do like agree with you that like the narrative is incredibly important, but from, I guess, the music point of view, like it's just a far more interesting for, like, to me, like piece of music to try and animate to, as opposed to, say, like one particular the complete antithesis of this in Allegro non Troppo is incredibly interesting, comparing it to the Rite of Spring and like the very stock standard kind of approach to that. Yeah,
as we get to that Bolero adaptation, that one's gonna lead to some very interesting comparisons and contrasting. Do you remember how this one starts, though?
In space?
No, before that.
Before that. Oh, right, yeah.
There's a wind chime guy who takes a bump. Yes. And I don't know if it was a bad take and someone happened to do it, or if it was actually just this cynically planned, haha, we'll have some wacky comic relief take a bump beforehand to say, oh look, we're messing with the fourth wall a bit. Someone in the orchestra made a mistake. It's kind of nice to be able to second guess yourself, and even when you're watching something as simple as Fantasia, that there is still a little bit of room for doubt in how it was produced. It's nice to have some mysteries, that movie magic. Even if you don't know if this was a bad take or someone intentionally taking a bump.
I thought when you said before it started, you meant the way that they introduced the themes. Like,
Deems Taylor referring to science as a questionable source. The tone he takes throughout that intro is very much a sign of the times. I mean, it's a Disney production, it's always going to have that. Certainly, it's a Walt Disney production, and so it's always going to have that somewhat conservative bent to what's going on, and it's kind of funny.
Well, I mean, he specifically says, if, you know, the way that science tells it, like life started at the bottom of the sea with
single organisms that may have been, what was it?
Green or white of not very much at all.
If you had...
and monsters and horrors.
Yeah.
Yeah, so all the creatures in the past were all monsters and horrors, is the main lesson here.
If you had a piece of media today be set in the 1940s, this is how they would have people talk about science. Mm-hmm. As like almost a parody or just a look at these stereotypical olden day people.
It's some unknowable magic, basically. Though, you know what is magic? Is the volcano segments. Now, so there's 2 points here about the volcanoes throughout the Rite of Spring's earlier stages. The second one, I guess the second point, because it happens a bit later, is there's that one really big volcano. We're going to see some visual callbacks to that in heavy metal, in a spot that you're not going to expect. The other thing is the percussion throughout the Rite of Spring, combined with the way that the lava moves and the timing of the volcanoes exploding. I think the biggest influence that this has is honestly in computer games, particularly in platformers. Just any sort of platform game that has a lava level owes so much to the depiction of the volcanic regions in the Rite of Spring segment here. Just the timing, the coloring, it all has that really, really video game feel. I think the most immediate one is Banjo-Tooie, Hellfire Peaks. Hellfire Peaks, because it's fire and ice ones. You see, it's a pun. Very clever. But the music in the fire version of that level really has a similar sort of percussion and tempo going on.
I was talking about being annoyed every time I noticed something like that. Yeah, that was definitely, oh, god damn it.
Damn it, moment. Everywhere you go in life now, you'll be seeing Fantasia.
This movie that I did not like at all.
And then you'll see Mickey and it'll be all okay again.
It'll be...
his smiling face.
Kind of okay.
Actually, we didn't mention that the there is a segment where a silhouette of Mickey goes up to the conductor and shakes his hand, which I'm pretty sure is one of the first instances of mixing animation with live-action footage. Because Song of the South was 6 years after this.
Great, so you've ruined Who Framed Roger Rabbit for me now as well. Thank you.
Oh yeah.
Just what a great day this is.
Hey look, Fantasia didn't ruin Chinatown for you, so it kind of ruined Who Framed Roger Rabbit that much. Then we have the intermission with the improvisational jazz. And the ultimate in the Winamp visualizer attachment, where, hey look, here's the quirky little line, it makes funny shapes when different sounds play. Whoa!
I don't think we have anything really to say.
Yeah. Solid's just shaking his head here. I will say that probably the longest impact of this is, I do honestly feel that this might have been part of the inspiration for a Chuck Jones short in 1960 called High Note. Obviously, it's a Chuck Jones short, so it's all the Warner Brothers wacky lowbrow humor. So that's a short which is a bunch of musical notes. Construction workers, that assemble the sheet music for the Blue Danube. And then it starts playing the music, but then one of the notes is too busy getting drunk in the sheet music for Little Brown Jug. And he wreaks havoc on the performance of the song, and then all the music notes slack off and get drunk as well, because it's Chuck Jones short, and that's so countercultural. But I do honestly think that this sort of gag routine playing around with a visual representation of music in the most abstract sense was probably part of the inspiration for that piece.
So something good came out of it.
So yeah, something good came out of it. A fun little Chuck Jones short.
Certainly not enjoyment of us today. But luckily it didn't go for that long, I guess.
Unfortunately, what did go very long is the Pastoral Bloody Symphony by Ludwig van Beethoven. Oh, I think my favourite part of this entire sequence is in Deems Taylor's intro, where he really adheres to the company line with Disney, where this is a film where every segment had a different unit director. None of them were Walt Disney. And he credits this as Walt Disney's creation and conception was that we will set the pastoral music to the Greek mythological elements. Thanks to Walt Disney, because Walt Disney is the only creator in the Walt Disney Enterprises.
Another one of these shorts I forgot about.
Oh, there's so little to remember. All the other ones have really interesting, at least up to this point, have had interesting color and interesting lighting, and at least one or two interestingly framed shots. Mm-hmm. But this is so flat. Like, when you think stereotypical Disney meadows and happy Disney faces, this sequence has it all. You got the happy fat drunk Bacchus who looks like he could pop up anywhere. You got these very smiling, happy little unicorns. You got the cherubs flying around. It's just so dull. Really, the best part of it is that Zeus is a dick.
Yeah, Zeus turning out absolutely saved it. Well, not saved, but certainly turned it around for me, at least, for a little while.
What really saves it is you get that storm segment where it becomes visually interesting again.
Yeah.
It really is just the bits where Zeus starts throwing lightning bolts willy-nilly, then gets bored, tries to fall asleep, but he can't because his bed's full of lightning bolts. And so he just starts knocking them out of his bed, and they just happen to strike. And there's that wonderful little implication that he might have killed people with those lightning strikes. But it's all off-screen. Although there was actually the first on-screen Disney murder earlier, when we saw that Tyrannosaurus Rex murder the crap out of that Stegosaurus. I know Solid was cheering for the T-Rex in that scene.
Yeah, well, who would ever want a boring Stegosaurus to beat the most exciting dinosaur?
What? They have a club tail! A spiky club tail. It's like a mace for a tail.
I mean, I would like a Stegosaurus to beat another generic dinosaur.
Look, man.
Cool
You know, tail whip in Pokemon reduces defense. Spiky tail whip, you're reducing the defense and delivering piercing damage. That's sick. 2 for 1.
I reiterate, the right dinosaur went over. Best for business. T-Rex went over.
The T-Rex doesn't put over any talent. It's a bad worker.
Doesn't need to. He has the buys.
Oh, he doesn't need... Oh.
He sells out arenas.
The T-Rex is a draw, you see, because you always book him, right?
Yeah.
Look, man, do you see the T-Rex doing jobs to Kane when he's 50 years old?
Doesn't
I don't
need
think
to.
so.
Swear to God, you did it.
I didn't even start the wrestling metaphors, mate.
I would say with the one we're talking about right now, the Greek
The
mythology.
Pastoral Symphony.
Yeah, okay. The only reason why I really remember it is because I think that was when it fully solidified in my mind how much I was not enjoying the film.
Yep.
Because there was Mickey before, and that was okay. That was, well, I thought it was the best one. And then there was the dinosaur one, basically. And they were both probably
They're the
best
best
of
ones.
the bunch. And so I was
Well,
kind
they're
of...
two of the best. Night at Bald Mountain is my favorite.
Okay, fair enough. But we were on an
Well, it's
upward
my
swing
favorite.
at
It's
that
my
point.
favorite, but The Sorcerer's Apprentice is the best one.
Sure, that's fair. But it really had a big come down with
Yeah,
with this one.
it's the piss break one.
Yeah.
Did we stop for food at this point? I think we may have.
I think some food happened around this time. I didn't mention there are a couple of things about this. I mentioned one of them while we were watching, and the other I'll mention now. So, the female centaurs throughout this segment, you briefly see some boobs with no nipples, and then it switches to lots of flowers around their chests. That was put in the final draft before the theatrical release, because the publisher didn't like boobs, which I find funny because when we get to Night at Bald Mountain, I'll be bringing up boobs again. The other thing I didn't mention is that this cut, and every cut of the film since 1969, has recolored some of the centaurs. You saw how some of them were weird shades of green and blue and purple. That is because they were all very, very blackface.
Oh,
And one of them was washing one of the white one's hooves.
Oh no!
And some of them, you see how they had like that southern belle pickaninny hair? Yeah, so...
And they did leave those two in.
Yeah, there's two of them which are, look, it's the zebra ones, so now they're wacky African ones. Those have somehow been able to stay throughout later editions. But yeah, there were a bunch which were just clearly just black slaves. And this was 6 years before Song of the South, which I hate to bring up again, but Song of the South was, I think, it was well-intentioned. It was just a case of white people not understanding any of the cultural damage there at all, and making something that wound up horribly offensive. Whereas this is clearly just people not caring, just draw some Negro slaves. And thankfully, that is an edit, and editorial process is usually a very good thing for refining your art, and, like, Fantasia would be really hard to watch if it was still that cut.
It's hard enough to watch, really.
Savage.
But it wouldn't be a Disney film without a story like that, even if it was edited out later.
Disney was mildly, well, I guess this isn't mildly racist.
Now, Dance of the Hours by Amilcare Ponchielli. This was... Well, I mean, this one is kind of matching up to the ballet, where you have a bunch of dancers who represent different times of the day, and they kind of frolic around, and then they all have a wacky dance-off at the end.
It's the hippos and the crocs, right?
This is so that's the thing. No one remembers the ostriches, and no one remembers the elephants, because they suck, and they're boring. You get some kind of nice ideas with the elephants, where there's just a bunch of gimmicks with bubbles that kind of serve as foreshadowing for ideas that would happen in Dumbo, which was the next film from memory in the animated canon.
Oh, you know, I just think I realized something. I remember, I think it was the hippos and crocs. Kind of like you mentioned, liking the mushroom segment as a child. The crocs and the hippos kind of frightened me as a child. Just whenever the part where they're running towards the screen, just that visual when I was probably like 3 or 4 would just
That sort of thing will stick with you at that age.
Yeah, it was just like, what the hell is this?
And now you see it now, and I believe your words were, "What the hell is this?" I love the alligators. I'm pretty sure they're alligators because they've got the really narrow snouts.
Yeah.
I love them because they're the hammiest ones by a long mile. They're just coming in with these wacky capes held up to their faces like the Bela Lugosi in Plan 9, or the double who's pretending to be Bela Lugosi in the later shots when Bela Lugosi died. They're just sneaking around. They have these dramatic stretching of their arms. Once again, you get the most interesting lighting around them with their shadows projected against the walls. They take some wacky bumps. They do some cool spinning around each other. I mean, like, this whole thing really does kind of turn into, like, this weird sex thing between the lead hippo and the lead alligator. And I guess that's cool.
I was really surprised by how much weird sex stuff was kind of like there was a
Well,
sexual
it's
theme
art.
in a lot of.
It's arty, it's cultural, it's classical
Yes.
music.
I guess especially because of like when it was made as well. I wasn't expecting so much like sexual kind of undertones.
Yeah,
that
if it
way.
was
not
the-
just in this one,
yeah.
but in a lot of them.
Well, if it was like 1925, then it would totally make more sense.
I was wondering if the mushrooms were unintentionally phallic, because I mean
They're mushrooms, that just happens.
that's a good point.
That's just
Always
hard
that.
to avoid inherent sexuality with mushrooms.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the Night on Bald Mountain,
Oh man.
and also Ave Maria. But I honestly like to cut off the film once the bells start ringing, because
It's a better ending.
yeah. So Disney in modern times like to say, even though the text says, well, the devil lives on the mountain, like to say, oh no, this is Chernobog. Not to be confused with Chernobog, the Slavic deity that may or may not have been banal. We don't know because, early folk tellings of it have disappeared and been replaced entirely with the local Russian Orthodox Church tellings of the demon.
It's a running theme with a lot of Slavic folklore. Like, you'll be like a villain in one story, and the next it will be kind of just antagonistic. Sometimes it'll actually help them.
No, you just got to put death in the sack. That's always my favorite Slavic folktale. Anyway, it's clearly the devil in this piece, and I do feel that even with this 2-hour music video experiment, and even though there isn't much narrative, this still has the feel of a lowest point than a heroic climax. And so Walt does still understand, even at this point, just basics of film-going experience tying into structure of modern myth structure, that you want to have the audience going out on a high note after they've been brought down that little bit. I mean, we could also argue that the last two segments were the low point,
Yeah.
and that Night on a Bald Mountain is the heroic moment because you got something that's actually visually interesting and with really good music.
Yeah, I mostly remember I feel like there was two parts to this, right? There was like,
Yes.
I don't
It's-
remember
it's-
the second part.
It's
much
the
at all.
devil has power, and then the devil is rejected and turns back into the mountain, and a bunch of lights sing Ave Maria.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They're so pious that even the trees become literal straight and narrow, further accentuating the divine spirituality here.
Yeah, I have to admit, I actually was really struggling to work out what was going on in this one. Like, I was enjoying the visual of the first part of it with the demon and
Yep.
all the things it was doing. But I remember when the second part came around, I was like, are they going to fight him? What are they going to do? And I thought he was going to sleep. Like, I literally thought he went back to sleep. I didn't realize he was being rejected, so he turned back into the mountain. I just
Yes.
thought, oh, he's tired.
Yeah.
That was how
Yeah.
confused I was.
Like
He was
Zeus.
just- I thought he was just tired.
He went to bed. Oh, knock some lightning bolts off Bald Mountain. Maybe strike some parishioners or something. I don't know.
Turn some fire ladies into some demons.
Yeah, I do feel that there is a very conscious rejection of him going on, the ringing of the bell, then the people singing,
Yeah.
which is interesting to me because Disney, as I was saying before, is so heavily built around that Jiminy Cricket, when you wish upon a star, dreams come true, that there's usually, particularly in the early Disney films, especially pre-Renaissance, there is very much this lack of determinism in a lot of their protagonists. And this is a very definitive deterministic moment of this overt rejection by the populace, which is an interesting little counterpoint to a lot of what Disney stuff was at the time. And Harpy Tits. So I bring up Harpy Tits, and as you will see, as we go through later things in this Fantasia suite, as I call it, Harpy Tits has remained in the public consciousness. Especially, so you know how among sound techies, the Wilhelm scream is this running gag.
Yeah.
Amongst animators, Harpy Tits is a running gag. Because even though this film, before it went to the final cut, it removed all the boobs on the centaurs, and even though in 1990 there was a VHS cut of The Rescuers where the video editor snuck in some full frontal nudity in a rapid transition shot, which then caused a product recall. So Melty Man didn't know about that trivia. This is what really fueled things like the Leave Saying Sex conspiracy in The Lion King
like
is because there was actually a time that someone slipped in the VHS cut, full frontal nudity. And I think part of their logic of trying to get away with it is just no one likes the Rescuers, so you're not gonna see it. Rescuers Down Under though, that's freaking great. Rescuers 1 sucks. Anyway, so even with all that, this was an edit. The source of this edit was 2000, and yet your screen still gets filled with full boobs with nipples. And so it's an odd thing that this artistic decision has remained through all the edits. And so it has become a bit of a meme for animators. We'll be seeing as we go along. You can watch for the harpy tits in the later things that we're watching. Now, I remember, Melty Man, I linked you a short called Double King a few weeks back.
Oh, yes.
Short film, it's up on YouTube, made by a guy in Tasmania.
I've forgotten his name, but there is a particular short in Allegro non Troppo that like rang bells for me.
Yep.
For that.
Yes.
But that was the end of Allegro non Troppo, not this.
Yes. Yeah, so anyway, if you go back and watch Double King again, when the king arrives in Dead, there's harpy tits there. Like, it pops up in the weirdest of places because it's just this certain sorts of animators who were really influenced by just the truly groundbreaking visuals going on in Night at Bald Mountain. There are so many technical tricks being invented on the spot here. And there's so much of it's imprinted in your mind that things like just the harpy tits stick with you.
So, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Dumbo, harpy tits, all ruined now thanks to this movie. Thank you so
Wait,
much.
What? Harpy tits are ruined for you?
Or improved.
What?
And that brings us to the end. There's no ending credits. There's no the end.
I was surprised by this.
Yeah, it just ends with the sunset, which is this nice final closing moment of tranquility to it all. So,
Thank you, Apollo.
Now, strictly speaking, there was another thing from 1976. The same year as Allegro non Troppo, there was a Chuck Jones TV special called Bugs and Daffy's Carnival of the Animals that I did not show you because I don't think it really matters for discussing the influence of Fantasia, because it basically just does the exact same thing as Fantasia, just with some Bugs and Daffy gags at various spots in it. If you want to check it out sometime, go ahead. But really, it's just like, if you've seen Bugs and Daffy having a report together over the years, it's just that. You could watch like any other good Merry Melodies or early Looney Tunes short. Though I do have in my notes here that I wrote Bugs and Daffy with a slash in the middle, so I guess that means that I ship Bugs and Daffy, and I'm perfectly okay with that. That is my Warner Brothers one true pairing. So Allegro non Troppo, a film from 1976 by Bruno Boggetto.
Holy crap.
So, the first thing I'll say is, you may have seen, if you were around on the internet around the turn of the century, there is a little flash animation called Yes/No, which is by the director of this film. Melty Man's got this look here. It's one of the earliest cases of a good comedic short using flash animation that isn't a Star Wars parody. It's just very simple shapes because he's just getting the hang of automated tweening animation. Do you want me to explain that further?
Sure.
Alright, so there's basically two schools of approach to animation. There's the traditional Disney style approach, and there's what's generally considered the more Eastern style approach, which is more of an economy approach. So in the Disney style, you're running film at 24 frames a second, and you make sure that you're drawing an intricate frame for every single one. The Eastern style is you basically go on the cheaper bit and you divvy it up. So you take greater influence in a way from things like French visual theatre, where you really focus on what are the key visual moments of any particular sequence. You put the most detail into those frames of animation, and the rest, it doesn't matter. You can actually make them a bit more flubby and loose, and those are known as the between animations. And how Flash as a program works is you can draw up a bunch of images, assign them as keyframes. And although it's a painting-based program, which means you can assign pixel by pixel the visuals, it's also a vector-based program where it will detect your shapes, and it will assign them as shapes which can be drawn around like an architectural drawing program. And what this means is that it can automatically create the between frames for you, and moves things around. If you've ever seen really early Flash animations, the really, really bad ones, you see there's points where a lot of transitionary sequences will have things becoming these weird abstract shapes, kind of blobbing around a bit. That's because they haven't made enough definite keyframes to transition smoothly. So it's taking the shapes and just brute forcing them into the next frame. So Bruno Bogetto understood that this was a limitation, and he didn't have the time or interest in doing anything, so he used just purely abstract shapes to make a bunch of gags about road safety guides. So this guy is on the ball with like how to do animation on the cheap and how to tell jokes. So let's talk about his Fantasia parody from 1976. Would you like to know what the title means?
I would.
Not so fast. That should help explain everything, because I mean that is a statement of intent and central theme to this film.
I don't know where to start. I mean,
It's blunt. It's Italian.
yeah, it's wonderfully Italian. I'll give it that. It is the absolute antithesis of Disney.
In almost every way.
I mean, no, please go.
Yeah, I would say it's far more cynical than Fantasia.
Absolutely.
It both in its overriding meta plot, where we see the orchestra and the artists and the guy in charge and all those, with the in between parts, which would have been which for Fantasia would have been with what's his name again, the actor, the guy who was.
It was music critic Deems Taylor.
Yeah, would have just been the little Deems Taylor, which he was just like giving us information really.
He was just the friendly Walt Disney voice for the show.
With Del Troppo, we had. I don't think that's the actual title.
Allegro non troppo.
Non Troppo with Troppo.
With Del Troppo. It's like Del Taco.
Yeah.
Guillermo del Troppo.
With Troppo, we have an actual story going on between the shorts, which is probably just as important as those shorts.
Yeah, it's telling the story of a Shonky Carney who is making a bootleg knockoff of Fantasia.
Yeah.
And he's doing so in the grimiest way possible. He's extolling the virtues of true artistic freedom while having his animator literally in chains and having a very fat, abusive conductor who serves as his flunky in terms of physical abuse. His freshly procured orchestra is a bunch of old women who are locked in a cage and are given out grey slop, which may or may not be soup, as their only rations.
Yeah, I think Melty was talking about it during the film, just like the difference between the cleanliness and the organization of Fantasia versus the grime and the just chaos of Troppo.
Yeah, there's just the grime and the carny nature's kind of an interesting point, because almost every animation studio that's tried to go toe-to-toe with Disney always does come out feeling a little bit carny. And you look at the way the Warner Brothers always went, hey man, we're doing the risque jokes you've never seen. Hey man, I'm Tex Avery and I'm working with the Fleischer Brothers now. Hey, check it out man, you ain't seen Popeye do this before. Or when we get to we're still in the era of the DreamWorks face. Hey man, you don't see those Disney stories about finding your place in the world? You don't get that here, man. Shrek's gonna go back to his swamp, hey?
Scummy, that's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, it's a good word for it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it does kind of come off as a reflection of Walt Disney himself, who was in some ways, he was the carny who managed to cut ahead of the rest of the pack.
That's absolutely what I thought they were going for. Like, I didn't think they were just, like, parodying. I was wondering how much of this was just a joke parody or, like, actual, like, criticism of Disney.
Well, I mean, the nature of the texts themselves throughout that the animator makes.
I started to pick up on that, yeah.
Yeah. So the first animated segment that we have is the Prelude of the Faun by Claude Debussy. I'm not going to bother with the French title. I'm terrible at French. So this begins with a lot of this is its own creative material, but this one is very clearly riffing on the Pastoral Symphony. It's an interesting one because it's raunchy and laden with boobs, and very very stylized in a very crude way. Like, it's very clearly saying, this ain't your Disney. This ain't your dad's Disney, kid. But at the same time, it's a very interesting little feminist piece on this obnoxious old man who's part of an old system, who's insistent on encroaching upon the newcomers who are around, and ultimately shrinks until he is utterly insignificant and no longer... he's this annoyance who eventually shrinks and goes away. And I think that really highlights the leftist bent that this entire film has. You know, it's an Italian film in 1976. You're going to have a pretty strong socialist vibe.
Yep.
Yeah.
I like the fact that even down to the animation, like to start with, has that kind of griminess to it.
Yeah. And while it certainly stays grimy throughout, there are ways where it uses the grime to tell something really interesting. Whereas this one is more just, here's the general grimy tone that's consistent with the film segments you've seen so far.
Strikes me as interesting in that feels like almost like I see a lot of TV shows do stuff like this where they put the crude sex episode first, the same way they put the crude sex short, I guess you'd call it, in first here as well. It's just interesting to me to see that.
Catches the eyes and sets the tone.
Yeah.
No, it's an effective technique.
Yeah. It's just funny to me to see, like, so far back.
So wait.
That was still the basic way of establishing a certain tone to things, like especially like a grimy tone or an adult tone. It's just, here you go.
This is in the middle of, like, the peak of exploitation films.
Yeah.
So, you know, really coming in, hey, kid, here's the carny guy coming in, hey, kids, come in this tent, you know, never know what you're gonna see, man. You're gonna see, like, it's like Disney, man, but, like, there's tits, these big titty.
Maybe you'll go out and behind a dumpster find a dirty magazine or something.
Because, you see the second Torchwood episode, the more adult,
every
raunchy
freaking
version
Torchwood
of
episode
is the sex one. Angel was another one I was going to talk about. Yeah, for them it can't be the very first episode because you have to establish a pilot for the first episode. But the first episode they had the chance to.
The first procedural episode.
Yeah, it's
we're dark, we're different. We've got sex.
Yeah.
Now, from memory, there isn't much to talk about in the interstitial between these, but then we get to the Seven Slavonic Dance by Anton Dvorak.
Oh, man.
No, Pikachuan. Deja vu. Okay, got my anime joke in. You want another anime joke? This song's used... This is going to be a fun one, because you know what the content of this piece is about. The first time this piece is used in Legend of the Galactic Heroes is a scene which is a young Reinhard talking about his lust for power. So, there's an interesting coincidence 10 years later. 12 years, I think, at the time of production.
So everything... So we've got Fantasia ruining things, and now we've got Allegro and Troppo...
Improving things.
By
By providing an extra layer of synchronicity. How... This short... What actually, Solid... Tell us your thoughts on this short first.
I don't remember it.
It's the little guy building the house.
Little guy building the house. I liked these shorts a bit more than the Fantasia ones, I think, because they always had
Narrative.
they had a narrative, and they had you could tell what they were about very quickly.
Yes.
And another thing that I really, really liked, I was going to say this talking more about the next one, I believe, but I can talk about it here. Like, I really love how short they are. These shorts are actually short.
Yes.
And I don't think you can say that about Fantasia, where everything, I think, probably went a little bit too long.
It's that grandiose excess.
Yeah.
Particularly the ones you didn't want to have go long.
Because the worst thing you can do here, because as good as... they feel so much better than the Fantasia ones because they have that bit of narrative, but it's a bit of narrative. It's a very basic idea that can be gotten across very quickly, and the best way you can ruin that is by making it go too long.
Yes.
And it was my main fear throughout all of them, but they generally don't go for too long.
Well, they maintain the certain grimy workmanship throughout the intermission segments.
Yeah.
Whereas just, they get in, they make their thematic points, job done.
Yeah.
Get out of there. And what's the point of this one? Well, in the 2017 climate, we can look at this as the story of an angry STEM guy. An angry tech guy who thinks that he's the brand new trendsetter, he's the disruptor, and he ultimately gets radicalized, and it ultimately receives his comeuppance socially as a result. Obviously, this is this is post the fall of the Italian Fascist Party, and this is a story of a guy who's this bold new trendsetter. People follow him. He comes to resent them, and he tries to lead them to their doom. It's also, you can really tell that it's a few decades after the war because of the optimist, and this is after the Vietnam War's end as well. So this is a very optimistic time, and this was around the time that I believe the Greek fascist government came down as well. So, the military dictatorship, but yes. This is certainly a time where in Europe there's this real positivity around the potential for peoples to reject fascism. And I love that this ridicules him and treats fascism as a joke because it's the most effective weapon that you have against that doctrine. If you buy in, if you try to depict, even in a schlock piece, if you depict, the military efficiency and the pomp as a serious element or even a cool element, then you're buying into the fascist narrative, which is that it's cool and that it's efficient. Whereas this is just
Like
completely...
the Empire.
Yeah. This is like the Empire. Stay tuned for Star Wars hot takes next week. And this is one way. It's just completely absurd. His followers have to rip off their heads, juggle them, bash themselves in the head with a hammer, then eat the hammer. But ultimately, when he tries to lead them to their doom off the cliff, he jumps off the cliff, scrams his way back up, and they immediately give him the Branard salute.
It is strange, I think, though, to compare this with, which I hope is the next one, because I think it is.
Bolero's the next one. Dinosaurs.
Really?
Yeah.
Damn. Okay,
Yeah.
I was hoping. There's another one that I like to contrast it with in that is a lot less hopeful.
Yeah, well, I feel that these two segments that we're going to be talking about, the Dvorak one and then the Ravel's Bolero one, are a build to that one.
Yeah.
Very much thematically. So we'll talk about the Bolero now.
Sure.
And this is much like how the Fawn one was very much that this ain't your dad's Disney. This one really feels like Bruno Bagetto saw the Rite of Spring and went, I know how to do that better. I know how to give that actual intent and meaning while maintaining the sort of nice depictions of a primal nature.
Yeah.
So it starts off with a Coca-Cola bottle being thrown on the ground and a possibly human rocket ship flying off into space, and from there new life is created as the basic thumping that makes the entirety of the Bolero happen. As steadily what starts off as a small organism in the Coke bottle becomes a blob that moves along the ground and becomes a wide plethora of creatures as they march onwards through life.
Yeah, I like this one because of the intertextuality with the Rite of Springs one from Fantasia.
Yeah.
Because you've got I think you pointed it out, instead of having the complex music with the very simple visuals depicting evolution, you've got a very simple piece of music and a very complex animation depicting.
Yeah, just the squash and stretch is insane, the levels it goes to here. These are all very fluid, very flexible, continually changing and advancing creatures. Even when they've really started to take definite forms, there's this bounce and this throbbing to their gait that never leaves.
They all look weird and alien as well, which I thought was... And I like the way that they actually morph. They actually...
Yes.
The problem I think I had with the Fantasia one was there was just sort of it was
jump cuts.
It was, just jump cuts between the, quote, evolution, where it was just here's a fish, now here's a turtle, now here's a dinosaur that's on the land. Where this was actually playing with the actual...
Here's some swimming things, now here's some flying things. Whereas this, you see the process of things learning to adapt based on their surroundings and...
turn into a pile of snakes.
And of course, the biggest difference between this and the musical contrast and the visuals is, of course, there is a character, which isn't in the others, which is the monkey appears.
Those damn primates.
Yeah, Solid was making a quip at some point about how he thinks primates are the least interesting part of nature. And then lo and behold, here comes a primate that starts murdering everything it comes into contact with.
Setting things on fire, beating them.
It's funny that
using their skins.
Yeah, that Melty was talking about how great the visuals were. To me, I was finding very, very boring at the start of it. I didn't like any... I just wasn't interested at all, really, in it. It was just nice visuals for...
It's a very
nice
much a
visual
build to
sake.
a crescendo.
But then As soon as the monkey showed up, then I got into it. And
Yeah.
I was like, oh, there's actually...
So when the narrative showed up.
Yeah, I was really excited for that. I was really excited to see like a point to it. It wasn't just depicting evolution. It had an idea.
Yes.
And it's a dark idea.
Yeah,
but it's still
great.
interesting to
Certainly, I love,
with.
and I'll talk once we've finished it, the narrative of this one. I guess I will make a comment on the structure of this one because I think the structure is brilliant in this piece. So as they're marching along, then the monkey starts murdering stuff, and as it gains more and more tool usage, it of course becomes better at murdering things, and eventually gains the ability once it's understood the implications of fire. Unlike everything else in this time is still marching to the music, but this is when the monkey runs at triple the pace of everything else for the first time, and just disappears into the horizon. And that's when you start seeing the human constructs appearing, because you start seeing the signs of antiquity, the signs of war. It's interesting that there's only 3 points that anything actually stops moving in this piece. The first is there's an extinction event, which causes them to cower in horror as they start to die and change. The second one is the death of Christ, and the third is at the end when they reach the 20th century. So it's and the death of Christ one is really interesting to me because this is obviously a very secular film, but it's still a very Italian film, and so there's very much this acknowledgement of the local culture and history as the center of the Vatican for centuries at this point. And there is this acknowledgement of the culture around which shaped the world for so long. I mean, you can argue, certainly the visuals are arguing that it caused potential, either an epochal moment of reverence or a moment of stagnation for culture. You can take interesting readings from that. And then, of course, finally, the final movements halt because they are no longer able to walk forward as buildings and a city just emerges from the ground underneath them. As a gigantic statue, somewhat reminiscent of a pastiche of Mussolini, appears. Its head breaks open, and there's the monkey inside. The structure of this is really important, though, because that was a very dense bit of information. That is in roughly the last 40 seconds of a roughly 8-minute segment. And that's really important for depicting just how minuscule the scale of man's influence on the world, how great man's influence on the world is, also how relatively tiny it is in comparison to the vastness of the world around it.
Well, the old like, as a geologist, the allegory, metaphor. If you were to depict like the entire history of the universe as a calendar, entire human existence has occurred within the last second as we click over to the next year.
Yep.
And that's just frightening.
Yeah, it's. I think when you say it like that, it does sound really good. I do think that just watching it
On
kind
a
of
personal
basis,
level, you went that one.
I would have probably reduced the
Yeah.
amount of time between because it honestly really for me only got interesting near that end point where I realized there was a point to it. I think you could have cut out a lot of that startup.
Well, it's one which I feel once you know the full story is one that serves better on repeat viewings.
Sure.
Because now that you understand that, you can further appreciate the enormity that it's trying to convey as a text.
And it's definitely, you can tell it goes into conflict with, say with the Fantasia one, where it treats that kind of evolution as
A curiosity that you can have a little window into and then ignore.
Sure. While with this, as it's asking a question, you can disagree with it or agree with it, doesn't really matter, but it asks a question of, is this actually a good thing? Is it so great that human beings have risen from where they have and what they've created, what they've done, and what the effects that has had on the world? It's a really big question, so obviously we're not going to answer it on this podcast, but it's great to see it's great to see one of these shorts having a point and a question.
It's the piece which certainly sparks the most discussion, I feel.
Yeah.
But these last two are really, really building to something, because we've seen this ridicule of fascism, followed by this depiction of just the rise of the human machine. And I was mentioning before the points where it stops, and what it doesn't stop at is the depictions of war, which is certainly interesting because that can sort of lend credence to a realist theory where war is an inevitable part of a human cycle. And then it really, really, and that's certainly a reading that you could take from it, But then we get to Jean Sibelius's Valse Triste, which is the complete undercutting of any sort of claim about the inevitability of war by reminding you of the cost. It's about a cat starving to death in a war-struck home.
Yeah, I can't believe it's taken me this long to see it, because I remember you telling me about this probably like
Years
8
ago.
years ago or something.
Yeah, this was my favorite one.
Oh,
I don't have that much to say about it though, because
you don't need to.
you watch it and you get it, and
Everything about its visuals perfectly conveys what it's trying to get to you.
Yeah.
Which is,
Absolutely.
war sucks. Yeah. It sucks so much.
the kind of thing that I would like to show to like high school kids or
Yeah.
even primary school kids. Like this is a little short to embed the idea in their mind. Yeah.
It's a bit of a sad thing that the last DVD printing now costs about $150 because the prints are so rare.
That's crazy.
Because like that is a very valuable short film. And I think one of my favorite little touches in it is right at the start where the depiction of the house is this little ruin inside this completely cubist city around it, which obviously has the implications of modernity moving on. Also, I feel the visual really, really evokes. Have you seen the memorial to the Holocaust in Berlin?
I don't think so.
It looks exactly the same as the depiction that we have here of the city.
Ah.
It's just these flat concrete tombs, which are all completely rectangular. It's this very, very stark area. The sound engineering is really, really good there, because every single step that anyone takes in there will echo throughout the entire thing. 'Cause it's a piece that wants to evoke just the enormity of the loss, as well as the sound of a fascist movement moving. And so I like that it may just be my reading of it, but certainly really feels like it's an intentional nod to this memorial.
Well, it's the cool thing about it is that it doesn't matter. Like I didn't know about that memorial, and it's still perfectly.
Everything about the visuals is
and it was the one where I was really appreciative of how short these shorts were, and I already talked about that. But that in particular, I think it made its points, and my main fear in being, I hope it ends like fast, sooner rather than later. Even how much I liked it, because like there's not much more you can really say here.
Yep.
Yeah, you wanted to have that brevity.
Yeah.
Just like,
It hits the emotional beats it needs to, which is utter misery.
Yeah.
It's funny when it started, but considering how leftist a lot of the visuals and themes have been, I read into the boxy kind of buildings. I was seeing that as like America or something, as capitalism, and it wasn't really until like it's zooming in on a like blown up building, like a house, and the sad cat and all that. I was like, oh.
Then you realize,
Oh no, this is far worse.
It's a real shame that there's not that much to say to it, because if people listening to this they'll hear what we have to say about the other shorts, and there'd probably be longer conversations. They might think that, well, maybe those are the more interesting ones because we talked more about it. But this, I really do reiterate, this was the best one.
It is
of
the
both
best.
movies. This was just fantastic, and if you can find it on YouTube, it will be barely 5 minutes of your life.
Yeah, it's not very long yet, and it's impactful. This was the segment that really blew my mind as a kid.
Yeah.
The first time I saw a tape of this film.
And it shows that sometimes, I guess, simpleness and just a very basic thing can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah. It's just tapping into a very simple and very pure emotional core.
Yeah.
So then it's followed by... So we've had, like... It does ease you into somewhat by having that very long throbbing bolero. Then it hits you really hard with this, and then really feels the need to try and get you back in. So it then descends into complete farce for a bit. You get a live action segment of a man in a gorilla suit having a wacky cartoon fight in live action. It's
utterly ruining the film forever.
It's terrible, and I kind of think that's the point. Is just to, there's no way we can recover from this emotional point. And so we need to just completely swerve you as hard as possible, as quickly as possible. So it does that, and then the conductor gets mad at the animator and tells him to make something more upbeat. I think that's when they throw him in the piano to have sex with the hooker. Italian films, everyone!
The blatant sexual, just like...
And then we get this fun little piece. It's funny, so the piece is Concerto in C major for 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, strings, and Continuo RV 559 by Antonio Vivaldi. And it is interesting that this is the first time we've actually had a Vivaldi piece in these films. Because he, of course, wrote The Four Seasons and The Planet Suite, which are the easiest things possible to construct visuals to. And I'm really glad that both these first 2 attempts at doing a visualization of classical music opted not to do it. Because it's too easy. And would ultimately just come off as too banal if you did do it. Unless you're really about recontextualizing the music in some way. And neither of these are really interested in doing that, so I like that decision.
It's I want to just a random thought I had about the Rite of Springs is what I can't remember who was the guy who was talking. I forgot.
Deems Taylor.
Deems Taylor.
He's been overdubbed.
Yes, Deems Taylor. I will try to articulate this thought properly. I thought it was interesting in the way that they took Rite of Springs, which they apparently, I didn't realize this, Stravinsky wrote trying to but capture the chaos of the beginning of something.
Yeah.
And that they instead of like trying to do like some weird visuals with that, they're just like, let's throw science at it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Science wrote this story, not art.
so instead, I guess my point is like instead of like even like you were saying about Fantasia, instead of going the easy route of just taking something that literally has the thing in the title and doing that thing, they were like, we know what the creator wanted to do with it, and we're gonna do our own thing with it.
It's funny you mention that, Louis, because when we get to Fantasia 2000's climax, I ain't gonna be spitting some hot fire at its use of the Firebird.
Oh god. Oh no.
There may be a literal bird made out of fire. It may be making... Part of the reason I may be doing this is so I can just rag on Fantasia 2000.
A long con.
It's a long build. This segment is about a bee, a worker bee, who is happily trying to eat the pollen of a flower to do its job, and this damn young couple keeps having sex in the grass nearby. And, I mean, this is kind of appropriate again in the wake of the current Hollywood issues, where we're getting all these allegations and years of abuse finally coming out. So here we have this piece in 1976 about how this guy won't stop having sex and is just getting in the way of the women trying to do their job. And then finally she has enough and stings the guy. The end. It's played for laughs, though, you know, the idea that that the man getting any comeuppance at all comes at the cost of sacrificing the woman's life, you know, being interpreted as a sacrifice of career to get the justice delivered.
Yeah,
Man, I thought it was just a bee that was having a bad day.
yeah, I'm sorry, that's a bit of a reach.
Definitely off the man. Audience perception is everything. I'm just saying, again, the context that you view things in does always change your reading.
Sure.
It's like, I wanted to have Allegro on Troppo in tandem with Fantasia to change that reading, and yeah.
I mean, he was having sex with the same woman. I mean, technically the woman was just as much of a problem to that.
Yeah, she was just as complicit.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I have no idea what to say to that.
I was kind of reading it into similar themes from the end of
the Fawn one?
No. The one which ended with, you know, man. Oh my god. Is it the Bolero one?
Man being the statue?
Yeah.
Man being Mussolini?
So like some kind of like environmentalism kind of thing.
Just further impeding on nature is also...
Man impeding on nature.
Yeah, that's also a fine reading. You know, these are the things that are on my mind, and so this is how it impacts my reading of the text.
Yeah,
I don't blame you considering current climate of things.
and I don't have an alternative. I have to admit, after the cat one, I kind of...
You checked out?
Yeah, I checked out as soon as the ape man, ape in a suit showed up, and to me it was just all downhill from there, and I was like...
Hey. Firebird. We're getting to Firebird. Which is also a thing, because we've got here... Yeah, we've got the Infernal Dance of King Kachki from the Firebird Ballet by Igor Stravinsky, meaning Stravinsky's the first repeat composer in what we've been watching. And this is also going to be used in Fantasia 2000. So basically, the story here is that you get a bunch of wacky clay animation. Because, of course, this is an Italian production, and you gotta have your Pingu in there somewhere. The claymation is of God trying to form man. He eventually does so, as well as woman. These are very classic images: a stock squarey man, a round curvaceous woman. A serpent appears as it transitions into traditional animation, along with a tree bearing apples. We're going hard on here with the straightforward symbols most associated with the story of Genesis. And so the serpent tempts the man and the woman to eat the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. They both refuse him, however, and so the serpent, out of spite, decides to eat it for himself. And what does he discover that the true nature of evil is? But of course, unfettered capitalism. Constant rampant consumerism. As we have our Night at Bald Mountain equivalent, we see just this cacophony of just demons throwing a constant barrage of pornography, of alcohol, of promotions that the alcohol will make you more proficient at sex. Gigantic amounts of money and drugs and goods to purchase. Conveniences to make your life easier. Huge barrels of money that you could be pouring into the church to absolve yourself of your own guilt. Pouring enough money into the church to transform it into the Vatican. It's essentially the film's thesis statement made complete here. The film is called Not So Fast, and here we have a final statement about the evils of unfettered capitalism and control, and ultimately greed. Finally, probably the most interesting part of this is that in amongst this capital gone completely amok, there's also this running edge of state control over what you can say, and police brutality that gets brought in, which is an interesting little note to consider at the time this was made. And finally, the realities ultimately crush the serpent and transform him into a humble businessman, at which point he recovers from his vision, essentially, and ultimately rejects everything, spits out the apple, and resumes his life as a mere petty snake. Really, I think the conclusion we all reached is that the segment that follows this, as well as the B segment before it, really wind up having this dulling effect on the impact of the film's real thesis statement. And that the film really should have been doing everything it could to make sure that this is the final thoughts and message and images that the audience is left with at the end. Much like how Fantasia opted to close not with some narration, but just the sun setting on a bright, beautiful new day. So, this then leads to the finale, where, first of all, the animator decides to leave with his love interest janitor, and they transform themselves into the most stereotypical Disney prince and princess possible, fly away and live happily ever after. And the director attempts to get a finale to put in place. This requires talking to a giant animated mongoloid who shambles over to a bunch of boxes, grabs one, puts it on the ground, watches the box, and a sequence of ultra-generic endings for films happens. Men kissing women, guys getting girls, riding off into the sunset, people completing a sporting victory. The nicest thing about it musically is that it just goes through a long series of major key symphonic score closing out moments. So it's just going from one emotional swell and crescendo to another one, to another one, to another one. That's probably the nicest thing about it. Probably the bit that we all found the most memorable is the triumphant athlete finale, where a runner manages to cross the finish line first, but the finish line is instead a thin razor wire, and it cuts him in half. It's not the most subtle of things, much like most of this film, but that's certainly the image which is the most memorable out of this sequence. Obviously, we can interpret the mongoloid bringing over these boxes, ultimately representing the audience, as a final reminder of Not So Fast saying to become a criticism of television at a period when it was really having its rise throughout the world and in the middle class and developed nations. So that's really all we discussed in the final few minutes of this. Obviously, this is the day after, and there's probably details I've forgotten. But the ultimate conclusion we reached is that Vals Triste is at this point by far the best sequence. That's the one that stuck with us the most, and was certainly Solid's favourite. And there's just these little narrative issues, and essentially the problem with Allegro non Troppo is that it tries to have its cake and eat it as well. It wants to be this solid criticism of capital, and especially of the Disney branding and messages of consumption, as well as that familiar homely nostalgia. But at the same time, it also wants to be just a straight-up Italian farce. And it's these flat, farcical, absurdist moments that ultimately get in the way of its core message and somewhat muddle the experience. So a little bit of tightening and editing could have really wound that up, especially those last 15 minutes or so. And that is about it. So when Solid returns from his travels, then we'll be able to discuss the following films, which will be Heavy Metal, Robot Carnival, and of course Fantasia 2000. Thank you for listening to this. We'll talk to you again sometime soon. Though I should mention, we will probably be doing a show next week with our hot, immediate takes and reactions to Star Wars The Last Jedi, meaning that we'll be doing 3 shows about Disney in a row. And then the week after that will be towards the end of the Fighting EX Leia beta test. So that show will probably be once again about fighting games. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again soon.